Well, welcome back to From the Statehouse with Massachusetts State Senate Minority Leader Bruce Tarr. I'm Rick Moore. This is MSONEWSports. And Senator, thank you once again for continuing this now as we head into uh, almost the second month of 2023. And I guess an opening statement would be, how are things now that you're back full time? Not that you never were, but you know what I'm saying, full session.
Well, Rick, it's the new year and it's the beginning of a new 2-year session in the legislature. So the wheels of government are starting to turn. One of the first things that we have had to address ourselves to is the filing of bills. And just as a reminder, every bill that gets filed by the deadline must receive a public hearing. And so bills that are filed after the deadline need to be admitted by both the House and the Senate. And that still happens, but everything that gets filed by the deadline, is going to be subjected to a public hearing by a committee. And obviously, we engage in that exercise vigorously. And we had 6,020 bills that were filed in the House and the Senate. And that's excluding by request bills. And I can talk about that in just a minute. But 6,020 bills. Of those, 2,257 were filed by members of the Senate, and 3,917 were filed by members of the House. And I personally filed 132 bills. So that's not unusual. We usually have a large number of bills, and this year was no exception. And the numbers in total were not unusual. That's pretty much where we would expect to be. But as you can imagine, that's a large volume of legislation that now has to get processed. And so the bills have been filed. The clerks are now processing them. They're assigning them docket numbers, which is what they'll get before they get admitted. And when they get admitted by the House and the Senate, which they will be, they will then get Senate and House bill numbers. And then ultimately they'll get referred to a committee. But the committees have not yet been set up. That's because we still have to adopt rules. So there's a bit more to go in the process, but a very vigorous start to the bill filing exercise.
Before I ask you about rules, as the clerks are processing these, what do they use for protocol or prioritization?
Well, that's a great question, Rick. So unlike in some legislatures around the country, there really is no prioritization. All of the bills stand on an equal footing as they get filed, and then the committees will prioritize them, and the leadership of the House and the Senate will prioritize them. So that will come later in the process. But again, the House and the Senate clerk will also be referring those bills to committees, and they have a discussion between them about which committee is appropriate to be able to receive a particular bill. And sometimes, Rick, there is an agreement about that. Sometimes the House and the Senate clerk don't agree on where a bill should go, but ultimately they have to work it out. And that's actually given rise over the last few years to a relatively new phenomenon, which is that folks will file a Senate version of a bill and a House version of a bill, thinking that they may wind up going to different committees, but at least give 2 bites at the apple for the idea that's in the bill. So right now, as I said, the clerks are working on all of that, but until we have rules, we don't have committees. And so generally they're thinking about subject matter and subject matter committees, but we need to do the next step.
On the national level, Senator, watching the mess that went on in Congress, picking a new speaker and so on, I heard a lot about rules, and I heard a lot about bargaining and all this other stuff. And I got to tell you, with all that's been going on news-wise, at my age, I've begun to really wean myself off the news and start looking at cartoons, because it's so disturbing if you think about it. But what are rules with respect to the Massachusetts legislature? What does that mean, and how does it work?
So first of all, Rick, I want to say I can understand how you could be discouraged, and I hear regularly from folks who are discouraged by what they see in our nation's capital. And we continue to hear about issues where a stalemate causes a significant jeopardy. One of them being the debt ceiling, which is being negotiated right now, or hopefully being negotiated, in terms of how that's going to be dealt with. But the rules basically, Rick, govern how we operate, and there's a set of Senate rules which govern how we operate. And then there are joint rules, which are agreed upon, hopefully, between the House and the Senate, which govern things like joint committees. So most of the committees in the legislature are joint. There's, generally speaking, 11 members of the House and 6 members of the Senate that deal with all manner of things, like the Committee on Education or the Committee on the Environment or whatnot. Those actually are comprised of House and Senate members, unlike in other places where there might be a House Committee on the Environment and a House Committee on Education and a Senate Committee on those things. We don't do that in Massachusetts. There are a few committees, however, in which each branch, each body has its own version. So for instance, Ways and Means. There's a Senate Ways and Means Committee and a House Ways and Means Committee. And there are a few of those, but mostly they're joint committees. But Rick, the rules govern all manner of things in terms of who will be presiding at a particular session, what the parameters are for debate, who gets recognized for debate, how the clerk operates as the parliamentarian of the body, when a matter can be, for instance, laid upon the table, i.e. delayed for consideration, when you can request to have amendments to a bill printed in the calendar so that folks can read them before the next session. So literally every aspect of how we operate is covered either by the Senate rules or by the joint rules. But it's important also to understand that at the beginning of each session, we agree to those rules. And so at the beginning of each session, there's a consideration of whether the rules have worked in the way that we want them to in the past session, whether we want to change them, and how we might want to change them. And I'll give you an example, Rick. One of the things that has been very important to me, and also to my colleagues in the Senate, have been making votes of committees public, having them on a website so that folks can see them. And we were able to change that rule a few years ago in the Senate so that our committee votes are available publicly in that way. The House has not done that yet. We continue to talk about that. Another important rule is when we go past a particular hour. So I think you've read and seen in the last session, sometimes we have conducted session all night and sometimes into the early morning hours of the next day. There are rules that govern that. There's a rule that governs when we go past 8 p.m. and there's a rule that governs when we go past midnight. And that's something that we're looking at very seriously right now to see if those rules are appropriate and whether or not they need to be changed. Because many of us feel that unless we have an emergency, there's no reason to continue the session until 4 o'clock in the morning, or in one case, we went well into the next day. There are certainly times when that needs to happen, and in those occasions, you could suspend a rule to be able to do that. So there's a lot of discussion about those kind of things.
That's fascinating, and it is encouraging to hear how Massachusetts handles things in the legislature.
You know, Rick, I don't mean to interrupt you. What I should say, because this is of interest to folks on the North Shore, is that in the Senate, the Rules Committee is led by Senator Joan Lovely. And she and I have been collaborating on a rules proposal. And again, it's a reflection of how we operate in a bipartisan manner in Massachusetts. Joan and I have been going back and forth. We've had regular discussions, and we might not agree on everything, but we are in very productive conversations about what those rules should look like. And I just thought for folks on the North Shore, it's important to know that.
There's that Gloucester-Salem connection again.
Absolutely.
Okay, finally, on a human interest note, Senator, on tartalk.com, you have a picture of a lady from the North Shore who does wonderful portraits with a different objective in mind. And I wonder if you could comment on it. It says, I am more. And she had one time, I am more Salem, I am more Gloucester, I am more Cape Ann. This one is in Boston, and it says, I am Massachusetts. Would you comment on that, please?
I'd be happy to, Rick. This is an exhibit that has been in many places around the state. It continues to travel. And in fact, I believe its next stop may be at the North Shore Mall. And we'll be saying something about that very shortly on our social media. But this is, Amy's project is to understand that there is much more to us as human beings than some of the adversity that we have faced in our lives. And that we all are humans, and we all have many dimensions, and we need to be seen as having many dimensions and as having strengths and vulnerabilities that in many ways cut across each and every one of us. And she really has a knack with these portraits for really capturing someone and capturing their essence. And that's what this exhibit is all about. It's about saying, here is who I am. And I am not my disability. I am not my adversity. I am how I have addressed those things. And there are so many other elements to my life. And they're wonderful portraits, Rick. They're on the 4th floor of the Statehouse, and I've been honored to host the exhibit. And I'll give you just one example. Someone who was with us for the opening reception for the exhibit was my good friend Karen Nessenbenny, who is known to many because she is the general manager of the North Shore Music Theater. And Karen and her husband Stephen, in the earliest days of the pandemic, had contracted COVID-19. And they were both hospitalized. They were both in very serious condition. Unfortunately, Stephen passed away. Karen, after a long hospital stay and a very difficult battle with COVID-19, survived. And she is inspirational to so many of us that know her because she was not consumed by grief, and she was not paralyzed by what had happened. She certainly properly grieved and acknowledged the hurt of the situation, but she went on to help us all understand the strength that we have as humans, sometimes that we don't even recognize until it's tested. And she continues to operate the North Shore Music Theater. She's involved with charitable activities all over the region. And she is a reminder, again, of the strength that lies inside someone. And she deserves to be recognized. And this exhibit does recognize her and so many others.
I have a family member who was going through a very difficult time. And she saw there was an exhibit of Amy's at the Rockport police station. And I took her there to look at these portraits and what they said. There's also a dialogue that goes with each portrait. And she was so moved by it, and she felt so much better about herself. She wanted to be in a portrait, but it helped her in healing. And since then, she's just taken off. And that's how it affected me when I saw those.
So there is tremendous power in this type of exhibit in helping us to visualize and to recognize things that sometimes aren't very comfortable to recognize and to address. But the exhibit helps to bring that issue to the forefront and helps us all to understand that these folks that are depicted have shown us the way in trying to deal with a chronic illness, a mental health situation, a whole variety of things that come up in our lives because we're human, but also helps us to remember that there's a tremendous strength that we have in humans.
It's very inspirational. Yeah. And those people are very courageous. It's amazing. Senator, anything else you want to mention here before we conclude this session?
Well, Rick, I don't have anything at the moment, but look forward to talking with you again, hopefully next week or the week after that. And we can talk about rules and what will happen in that debate and whatever else comes up.